This is probably one of the least shocked I've been about what could be classed as a shocking result so far this season. Fulham beating Newcastle at Craven Cottage 3-1, and it was a really good performance from Fulham, really well rounded. And I have to say, when you look at that Fulham team on paper, and then when you think there's some of the quality and depth they've built a bit of a decent squad on the quiet Fulham, and this shouldn't be as much of a shock as it maybe is, and it's maybe a bit naive of me to say. And the performances so far this season have been really impressive, and they've got a very good manager. Marco Silva is such an underrated manager. I've done videos on him before, and he deserves so much credit. He's a really good manager for the level Fulham are at. But Newcastle, I have to say, this result has been coming. I think they've gotten results while performing really poorly at points. There was the Bournemouth game where they were so lucky with the disallowed goal in the last minute. There was the Spurs game where they won 2-1, but Spurs realistically should have beaten them. They had so many chances. And there's games I'm sure I can't even remember which they got points on where they maybe had to ride their luck a bit. And I know people look at Newcastle and say, oh, they're doing a good job and they're getting results when they're not performing at their best. But I think people misunderstand that footballing cliche, at least in my opinion, because I always think getting points when you're not performing at your best is good when you hit March and April, when it's been a long season. Your legs are going a bit. It's becoming a bit of a grind to get through games, and you're just eking out 1-0s, 2-1s, 2-0s, and just getting by that way and just building that momentum and keeping them going after you've been playing well for so long in the season. When it's the first 5 games in and you've been playing poorly while getting results, I don't think that's a case of you're getting results while playing well and that's good for the season. I think you'll get found out. You can't sustain playing as poorly at points as Newcastle have done and keep getting results that maybe it doesn't deserve. Eventually, it catches up on you. And as much as they had their 4 games where they got a really good points haul in 10 out of 12, there will come a point where you end up getting 0 out of 12 or like 2 out of 15 or something. And then when you combine with the issues and the noise surrounding Eddie Howe at the minute, it's not great. But we're going to focus on the game itself and how did Fulham unlock them in the attacking terms. We'll go over it now. Fulham lined up in a sort of 2-3-2-3 with Lukic in between the fullbacks maintaining a bit of width. Pereira and Smith Rowe as the 2 8/10s. Jimenez up top with Iwobi and Traore slowly starting off as the wide men but coming in narrow. And Newcastle, as they normally do, would look to press high, look to be aggressive, but the press was a little lethargic. And because of the width that Fulham created, that allows gaps in between that Newcastle press. So if one player didn't do his job well enough, that just opens so much space for Fulham to be able to play into. And one player that didn't do their job well enough, in my opinion, in the press was Alexander Isak. He was played round so easy, and sometimes he'd end up going between Leno and Anderson, and just the effort levels between the two just didn't look great. And when he was tasked with marking Joachim Anderson, who is the main distributor from this back line for Fulham. He's got a fantastic technical ability with his long range passing. You can't afford to give him space. And when you're the first line of press and you don't do your job well enough, the knock on effect that then has for the rest of the team is detrimental. He was caught at points just losing Joachim Anderson, and then at points the Fulham attack could start and the Newcastle shape got a bit discombobulated. You'd get Pereira dropping into the space between Lukic and Tete, where he'd be tracked by Willock, and then you'd also have Smith Rowe coming into the space between Robinson and Lukic, where he would be tracked by Fabian Schär. Joel Linton was out towards Robinson for some reason. Don't quite know why that was the way to do it, but whatever, what do I know? So Newcastle did have enough bodies to keep Fulham penned back in, and that midfield three is a good midfield three, but they're not a midfield three that's going to be great at taking the ball on the half turn in deeper areas. Smith Rowe and Pereira are good technicians in the final third. In the deeper areas, when you need that composure to resist the press, move around the corner, and get your team up the field, they're not that. So there wasn't a lot of playing through the midfield in these early stages for Fulham, but they did have the option to go long to Raul Jimenez, who had a fantastic battle with Dan Burn. Dan Burn would leave to engage him and contest any aerial duels or duels on the ground with him as Fulham would look to go long, and that pass from Anderson to Jimenez. Traore would then come in narrow, so would Alex Iwobi to look for second ball opportunities, where they could then get on the ball and drive at that Newcastle backline, maybe even find the diagonal out to in runs through Trippier, through Lloyd Kelly, if Jimenez could knock it on around the side. And another issue with Newcastle's shape and their press was the recovery runs from the midfielders was not great at all. So when that first press was beaten and Fulham could recycle the attack, you get the runners of Smith Rowe, you get the runners of Anthony Robinson coming in to then look to get on the ball, Pereira and Tete on the other side as well. And they just found their way past the Newcastle midfield so easily. And the first goal came from that exact scenario. Jimenez winning the header. The ball comes into that deeper area of the field for Fulham. They can recycle it in space in behind that midfield, get it to Traore out wide, who could produce a cross for Jimenez, and they get the goal. And that happened a lot throughout the game. And so once Fulham did this, this allowed them to push further up the field and push Newcastle back. So it'd be a very similar shape for Fulham with that sort of 2-3-2-3. Newcastle were dropped into two flat lines of a 4 and a 5 with Isaac up top. And one thing I probably should have touched on in the deeper phase, but there was an issue with Newcastle, and it came down to Anthony Gordon. Now, Anthony Gordon started off on the right as Barnes started on the left. And his pressing was a little bit weird. He wasn't bad with his pressing. If anything, he was a bit too aggressive into it. And he'd get caught coming from his position on the right-hand side over to Anderson or over to Bassi or over to whoever it just happened to be on that side in counter-pressing and in systematic pressing perspectives and situations. Whether that was because there was a frustration with what Isaac wasn't doing on the ball that could force him to come over. And him coming in too narrow. And as he was forced onto Calvin Bassi anyway in the pressing stages, so he would automatically be narrow anyway, it left that left-hand side a lot more exposed. Because then Joel Linton, once Newcastle were pulled into a more defensive shape, would have to tuck in with the rest of his midfield. It meant that Robertson could run off into space on the left-hand side at fullback and run at that back line. And this is where the quality of the Fulham shape really took into effect, as in these situations, you could get Wobie pinning Trippier back, you get Smith Rowe pinning Bear back, Jimenez occupying centre-backs as well as the striker. Lukic could then do one of two things. He could distract one of the markers in the middle, allowing Robinson more space to drive into, but then also provide an option that if Robinson couldn't create down that side, get the ball back to him and he could help distribute it to the other side. And Jimenez and Lukic did a really good job of helping those wide overloads for Fulham, but also providing the option that they could then switch it to the other side if the situation required it. And then they could do the same on the right-hand side where they could overload with Pereira, Traore, Tete and Anderson. And I have to say, this shape allowed Anderson to drive forward with the ball where his technical quality in his playmaking was used to great effect again, either combining with that overload on the right-hand side or firing passes into Jimenez, who could drop a bit deeper to look for it. Newcastle in these deep shapes still suffered with the space in between the line, midfielders' recovery runs, not tracking players. It was again just a bit of a mess in these central zones. And fair play to them, quality performance from them. But how did they defend on the other side of the coin? Now, Newcastle would originally look to build up in a sort of 2-4-4, Fulham pressing high, then dropping off into a mid block, and it would be in their 4-4-2 with Jimenez, Smith Rowe, sort of pressing onto the centre backs or blocking lanes into the two holding mids. Pereira would also back them up in pressing Joel Linton and Guimaraes from the back, while also blocking passing lanes and potentially dropping off to either Gordon, who would drop in from that right-hand side into the right half space, and Willock in that left attacking half space. And so it was really responsible. They managed the six between them excellently, just making sure they were getting their presses right and their shadows, covering the players in behind well. Really good balance with that sort of central pressing four for Fulham. The wingers would take care of the fullbacks, and the fullbacks for Fulham would take care of wide men naturally. On that right side, I also think Gordon didn't do a great job of coming in narrow too early, and that might not have been his fault. That might have been instruction. But in doing so, that allowed Robinson to come in close to him. The idea was to then get Trippier up the pitch early in that right wing position. Bit of an issue with that is Trippier doesn't have that breakaway pace to get up the field. I mean, he's never had it, but now in his age, he's lost whatever little he did have. And Iwobi did a really good job of making sure he was tracking those and forming into that back five when he needed to. Gave Robinson the resource he did to push inside and take care of Gordon. And he did a really good job of it, to be fair. Robinson, I thought he defended really well on that side. And Newcastle at points were forced into aimless long balls forward that resulted in nothing. There was poor hold-up play from Isaac up top and just general turnovers constantly for Fulham. And it just felt really poor and a real lack of adaptability to what they were facing. They don't have a great team against compact blocks. Guimaraes is the one technically gifted player, you say, that has that bit of quality that could break down a unit. but he's not started the season off in great form. And to be fair, that central four for Fulham did a really good job of preventing him from getting on the ball in any real time and space to hurt the shape and disrupt the flow of anything going on. So he was really limited in what he could do, and there was no one else that really just had the capability to pick up the slack. There was a time in the start of the second half when Newcastle got the goal when the high pressing of Fulham was caught out, and that was with Robinson got caught out of position on the left, so Bassi had to cover. Anderson was then focused on Isaac, who could look to drop into the central areas, allowing Isaac to come with him, and that created space in behind that if Anderson lost his duel, which he did, and it's a shame because apart from that, Anderson had a fantastic game on the ball and off the ball, where in doing that, that created the angles around Anderson, where he could fire the ball into Barnes or Gordon, who could run off their fullback from with out to in runs. Barnes got it on the left hand side and a really confident finish into the bottom corner earned Newcastle what turned out to be a little more than a consolation goal. But Fulham's shape was good for most of the game. Just the start of the second half, they got caught a bit lacking, but didn't have any bearing on the result. But Newcastle did at points have Fulham push back, and this is what it looked like. Newcastle would move into a 3-1-6 of sorts with Gordon and Willock in the half spaces, with Joel Linton as the centre attacker mid, alternating between dropping in alongside Gameras and pushing up, and Trippier providing the width on the right hand side, Barnes on the left, Isaac up top, and Kelly forming into the back three on the left hand side. And to be fair, they couldn't really break Fulham down a lot in these situations. Fulham defended well in their 4-4-2, and they adapted to the areas well that Newcastle would look to break through and find space to create an opening. And it was through both wings that Newcastle tried to do that. They didn't have sufficient enough quality in the centre of the pitch, as I said, to break Fulham down. Gamaras was kept out of the game by Jimenez and Smith Rowe when he was there. But again, you'd have Gordon's positioning dragging Robinson inwards into these areas, and Gordon could sometimes sit in that forward line to just make sure he had Robinson pinned back into these areas. But Iwobi did a really good job of tracking Trippier's movements into these positions and not allowing him to be exposed and turning that defence into a back five. He defended his area of the pitch really well, Iwobi. And to stop that space from getting opened up, Smith Rowe dropped in to turn it into a 5-4-1 and stay in line with the midfield to prevent maybe Fabian Schär from driving into this position and getting a shot off, because we know he's got a fantastic strike from range in these spaces. So that didn't get exposed. Newcastle were kept away, and no final third space was opened up to be exploited for Fulham. They defended that side really well. And likewise on the other side, where it would be Barnes dropping in a little bit deeper to get the ball here, receiving it from the back line, Tete coming up towards him, creating space between him and Anderson, which Willock could attack in the half space, but he was tracked really well, mostly by Pereira, who would cover that area well. Traore was left a bit further up the field because he was tasked with looking after the fullback, which in this case was Kelly, who was deep in the Newcastle back line, so he wasn't an overlapping threat until these situations started happening where Willock pulled off into the half space and Kelly would provide a very late overlapping run to help contribute to an overload in that position and open Fulham up. Again, Fulham defended well. Pereira got back into position. Traore would quickly drop in. Tete would deal with Barnes really well in general play. And Fulham just did their job of frustrating Newcastle excellently. Newcastle did try and change things around at the end of the first half just to try and get a bit of flow back into the game. And there was a lot of misprofiled players within this, not doing their jobs well enough. Not to maybe their detriment, just weren't suited in the roles they're in. Joel Linton is that centre attacking piece in that three. Gordon in the right half space. So the change was made to swap what Barnes and Gordon, where Barnes would maintain the width on the right hand side. Gordon, that's Trippier. Gordon coming over to the left hand side to provide the width. Joel Linton and Willock would swap positions. Willock had a fairly poor game, anonymous all throughout. So Joel Linton was operating in the left half space where he's at his best doing, and Trippier ended up in that right half space for the remainder of the first half to get some open play crosses away. But again, there was a bit more balance in terms of players being in roles that suited them, but a lack of quality again to hurt Fulham's shape, and they defended, reduced space, and there was very little that Newcastle did to hurt them. But full credit to Fulham, fantastic, and they'll be in for a good season. If you're a Fulham fan, you have every reason to have a bit of excitement for what comes later on this year. But Newcastle, it's how you bounce back from this. A home game against City on Saturday, while that is a tough game, obviously. Newcastle have hurt City before, transitionally, through the pace against the back line, who expose themselves. And this City team give you a bit of space in the midfield you can hurt. So if Newcastle can bounce back, what better way is there to bounce back with than a good performance and a potentially good result against Manchester City? But they need to get their performance levels up quick because this could hurt them. And it could be a long season for Newcastle if this doesn't change. But let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it, comment down below and tell me why either way, and subscribe if you want to see more. In a bit, lads.